So I think what COP 2021 or COP 26 has done for us is helped us, if we look at it very critically, it has helped us to review where we are at in terms of the lack of political of understanding or actually bringing to life the politics of the possible, what I call the politics of the possible. And I think what COP26, and I mean, one aspect of it, before I get on to the what I think are the more the drawbacks of this particular COP and COP in general, one aspect that has brought me really significant inspiration and helped me to really think that the world is still can be changed, as Angela Davis often says, and she recently celebrated her birthday. We have to continue pushing forward. Even when we think that things may not change, we have to think that we're continually able to change things. And I think the civic movements and the social movements and the climate justice activists that were part of the COP were very, very integral and continue to be integral for pushing forward conversations on a number of issues, including loss and damage, including how do we decarbonize and how do we begin to pay respect to indigenous communities and racialized communities that have been absolutely responsible as caretakers for the environment, and completely having a completely different view and a completely different way of organizing life, of being and of living together than European colonization has taught us. So I now want to move on to what we might consider the drawbacks of COP, and I think a continuation of these kinds of conversations and political discussions that have happened over these past number of years. I think what it has done for me in terms of how I see it is that it has brought about what I call the Great Deflection. And what I mean by the Great Deflection is the idea that European and capitalist states, including the United States and including North American, including Canada, including all of European former colonial powers, and even continuing colonial powers in many parts of the world, especially Caribbean. There's still a number of colonial territories that exist today, is that we have arrived at a point of considering how do we decarbonize, that is reducing the levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And the way we have done that, and the way we have begun, the political discussion has gone on about it, is to point fingers at the current exploiters of carbon fuels and fossil fuels. And those are, many of them are actually in the global south. This is to deflect against, and deflect from rather, the ways in which European powers and the United States and Canada have continued to both extract resources from the global south, but also they created both the international financial system and what we can call the colonial carbon economy in order for their societies to develop, quote unquote. So they have begun a sort of discussion around who is principally responsible and who are doing the most to reduce carbon emissions. And they have, given themselves the pat on the back. The United Kingdom has done this quite considerably. United States, both of whom are within the top 6 countries in terms of historical carbon emissions, have given themselves the pat on the back that we are doing the best that we can do, and over a period of time we have been moving towards net zero, and they've set certain targets by which to do that. However, many countries that are currently exporters and they exploit carbon fuels and fossil fuels have been, and this is by no accident, have been former colonies of the Europe and the United States in some cases. So we've arrived at the point where the consequences of climate crisis in many global South countries, which include death, debt, DEBT, dispossession, and dehumanization, are the hallmarks of the current calamity that we live in. Over the past couple of years, we've seen a number of extreme weather patterns and events and ecological breakdown across the globe, in particular affecting those countries that have been least responsible and have had taken the burden of actually having to do the most in order for their societies to continue to survive. So we're seeing, when I talk about the Great Deflection, I'm talking about the European Union deciding to implement what they call a carbon tax, a carbon border tax, which would have the effect of reducing exports from global South countries by over several $billion. And it would actually reduce global carbon emissions only by 0.1%. But they have decided to levy this particular tax on exports that are highly carbon intensive, especially from countries in the global South, which are in many cases their former colonies. Another sort of aspect of this is the international financial system and the International Monetary Fund and the role that that institution plays. We've seen over the pandemic, for instance, the IMF has extended a number of loans and increased the debts of a number of countries which can ill afford to take on additional debt. But because of public health and income and the social services that they require, in order to meet the demands of their population, in order to meet the safety and ensure that as many people as possible continue to be able to support themselves, the IMF has continued to increase the debt of many of these countries. But as part of that lending program, I think Boston University has done a really interesting study and has shown that only in a handful of countries, that includes Barbados, I think in terms of the Caribbean region, and I want to say the Bahamas, they've only included one very small aspect of those lending programs that includes resilience and includes some form of climate adaptation support. So I think to wrap up, I think we are in a current situation where the climate crisis is continuing to unfold and continuing to show disastrous and devastating effects, especially for racialized and indigenous and Black populations in the global South. And Europe and the United States are engaging in what I'm calling the Great Deflection, pinpointing and attributing blame to those countries who are exporting fossil fuels and whose economies have been shaped through colonialism. And they're saying on their part, they're doing the most, and they are actually putting a lot of the resources and a lot of the finance and support necessary and their policies in place in order to reduce carbon emissions. It is not the case. And it's actually just deflecting from historical responsibility for the problem. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that, Keston, an invigorating opening to the webinar discussion. So we'll move over to Harpreet Kaur Paul, who's going to be our second speaker.
Thank you so much. I wanted to hopefully carry on some of the threads that Keston started to raise and frame specifically in relation to what's in UNFCCC language referred to as loss and damage. What does that mean? What it means is that decades of inaction on reducing emissions and historical emissions disproportionately from colonizers is resulting in impacts that countries just do not have the resources to respond to. There are no seawalls high enough to prevent seawater from inundating lands. There are no ways to avoid the scale of flooding that we're seeing, whether it's from small island states to delta regions across the world. And these are impacts that are beyond adaptation. They've been set in stone by historical emissions, disproportionately by colonizers. And there are very little actions that can be taken to prevent them. Those actions that can be taken are often curtailed by an economic system that has continued patterns of extraction and exploitation that's left countries that are least responsible on the front line of impacts, so that a storm of the same scale has a very different impact in Florida compared to Haiti, for example. And that is a story not of geographic vulnerability, but of economic marginalization, political marginalization built on legacies of slavery and colonialism. So how have countries deflected, avoided, sought to escape having any responsibility for the fact that their inaction has led to these impacts? Well, in the UNFCCC, that story is one that started from its inception when Vanuatu, for the Alliance of Small Island States, tried to seek some kind of mechanism to ensure that they weren't left paying for the consequences of the sea level rise that was clearly already evident for themselves and countries in the region. And that conversation has been left at the discussion level through very convenient policy frameworks and technical bodies. And that's what we saw at COP26. So the G77 in China arrived as a group ready to negotiate for a loss and damage financing facility, something that they had failed to arrive at a group position on in previous years. And is led by the US, although with the EU and Japan and other countries very quietly not doing anything to encourage a different position, were able to change the proposal for a loss and damage facility that would help communities most impacted by climate change to a dialogue, which will go on for 3 years. And this is a conversation, as I said, that groups of countries like AOSIS have been trying to have for decades during which time emissions have continued. And if we think about the UK, I'm based in Oxford as I speak, its fair share of effort, if we're serious about limiting warming to 1.5, is 200% below its current levels, and that's physically impossible within its own borders. So what it has to do, if we're talking about climate action that's fair, is decarbonize radically and quickly within its borders and support action globally as well. But that notion of equity and fairness, which was supposed to be a founding principle through common but differentiated responsibilities and respect to capacities of the UNFCCC, is something that countries have sought to erode consistently, and the Paris Agreement itself was an important movement away from trying to insist that equity was a core principle of climate action. It hasn't stopped so-called developing countries, and I'm using this frame because that groups of countries are defined and under the UNFCCC negotiating blocks, not because I would define them in these ways. But that hasn't stopped them coming back, and they will come back to Egypt, where COP27 is going to be hosted, to ask for more than dialogues, to ask for some mechanism that can ensure that there's efficient, effective, ready resources for countries on the front line of climate today. But this story of kind of escaping results of impacts is one that we also see in mitigation as well. And so, as Kirsten says, developed countries that was in early industrializers are all too ready to point the finger at China and India and point to their net zero 2050 targets while continuing to expand oil and gas extraction. And even the notion of trying to limit warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees is a notion that we know will put billions of people's lives at risk, and the failure to take action more quickly in the past is one that has kind of thrown regions and countries under the bus when it comes to the types of impacts that we're going to see. And the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is huge. So something like 2 billion more people will just be impacted by food insecurity, water insecurity, and heat stress at 2 degrees compared to 1.5. But we're looking at far higher levels of emissions and far higher levels of loss and damage because of these failures and ongoing failures. And just in the last days, we've seen Mozambique, Malawi, and Madagascar ravaged again by Storm Anna. And as COP26 wrapped up, in the weeks afterwards, Odette or Rai hit the Philippines. And we know that those of us that are in the UK or sitting in an early industrialized country, that in the first 2 weeks of the year, we emit more in emissions compared to those in Rwanda, Madagascar, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Uganda, Guinea, Burkina Faso combined. So these historical legacies of injustice are continuing today in patterns of consumption in the global north. If we were just to look at loss and damage from a financial perspective, which I don't do in my writing, but for the purpose of just this brief intervention now, countries designated in UNFCCC speak as developing countries are anticipating to experience something like 290 to 580 billion US dollars of fiscal loss every year from 2030, from 8 years' time. And the upper end of that is as much as the combined GDP of the 80 most impoverished countries in the world, to give you a scale of what we're talking about. And one way in which early industrializers really try to deflect any responsibility is to say, well, we've got insurance will cover this. And of course it doesn't. And we're already seeing insurance companies pull away from insuring things like wildfires in California, let alone impacts elsewhere. And as I started off saying, the fact that net zero by 2050 targets are on the table is a scenario that will escalate loss and damage, is a scenario that continues to put Black and brown bodies under the bus for a system of growth and accumulation that has been in the making for hundreds of years, and that continues to keep resources away from countries being able to invest in what they need to decarbonize, build resilience, and address loss and damage when it does occur. So middle-income countries designated by the World Bank will be spending trillions just on loan repayments, be spending billions on trying to get access to green technology and vaccines, and will at the same time have billions extracted from the countries through tax avoidance, through trade and investment regimes that make it all too easy still for countries that were colonized to have their labor and resources extracted and their communities left impoverished while multinational corporations are able to reap the rewards of that system. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks so much for that, Harpreet. So we'll move to our final speaker, Alice, and then we'll open up the space for discussion. So just a reminder to people, if you'd like to put questions in the Q&A box or in the chat, please do.
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you for the brilliant and sobering interventions to Kirsten and Harpreet. So today I'm going to be talking from a slightly different perspective, actually, as someone who as part of the University of Warwick, actually went to the COP in the blue zone, so as an official delegate on the behalf of the university, and the kinds of impressions I suppose I had from there. And the kind of question I want to ask is, the public consciousness, you could say, about the climate emergency is very high, obviously since the 2018 IPCC report, Greta Thunberg. The science is, urgent, it's well known, it's widely in the media. And also, I mean, the claim about this webinar is that the links between climate and colonialism aren't very well known, or they're ignored, but actually increasingly they were very prominently displayed in this COP. And so what difference does knowing about these issues make? What difference do mass movements and action and urgency around climate injustice make? And what difference does knowing about the science make in the context of COP? So, I mean, and I think in some ways going to this conference revealed my own naivete in a way, even though one might think, being a sociologist and who's studied inequalities and long histories of colonialism and injustice, you might think that I wouldn't be very naive or overly optimistic, but I sort of thought there's a point to going, in the sense that I heard so many activists, so many fellow colleagues, or people who've worked in these areas before, saying you can't expect anything. We've been here before, and afterwards, when I was actually quite, I guess, distraught in a way over it. Had quite a common reaction, which was, what did you expect? Obviously this was going to be a failure. This is the way it is. This is the way politicians are. This is the way capitalism and colonialism work. I mean, many of it's true, since the beginning of the COPs, since the first one in 1995, Greta Thunberg's phrase, blah, 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 came from the first COP in Berlin, as Andreas Malm writes about in How to Blow Up a Pipeline, a book that came out before then, reflecting on this time in his appearance at the first COP as a climate demonstrator, and reflecting the scene, only to reveal that actually, it was smaller. It was only 500 activists, but it was all the same issues. This idea that, or the statement about it, the COP outcomes being a death sentence for Smiley Island states have been repeated at numerous COPs. And so this COP was not unique in that respect. Many of the news that circulated, I think, in terms of maybe the popular consumption, people who are less initiated or less following it might have seen it as sort of different, but you can see that actually they were present. They've just sort of got more media attention. And so what I mean in terms of the widespread media coverage of climate justice debates, you had in the mainstream news, and I even found it in the Daily Mail, not as much as in the Guardian and whatnot, but talking about the language of colonialism, the continuation of colonialism. What is climate colonialism? The BBC asks. Attention to these neglected voices about the exclusive spaces of the COP26. So there was a high level of media attention to this event. And I had actually a lot of people coming to me and sort of, in a way, explaining climate injustice and climate colonialism, almost as if discovering it, or not, thinking that I would have known very much about it. And so, I mean, it was circulated, and it was more in the attention, at least of some people who were following it. Obviously, not everyone was following it. And yeah, being in the place itself, it was a very disorienting and highly mediatized environment. You could never really get close to anyone. Like the picture on the right-hand screen is Nancy Pelosi's there, but it's like, you know, thousands of people, you know, Barack Obama and so on. Everyone is just a tiny person far away. There's so many different spaces of people being kind of virtually connected, and there's all these bombardments of televisions with, you know, disaster, it's emergency, you know, just all this kind of reels of videos and information about how urgent it is, how we can't do the blah, blah, blah anymore. It's real business, we can't do greenwashing, and yeah, very overwhelming, I would say, and constantly being, I guess, asked while there, or searching there for something that was going on both inside and outside the spaces as to what it all meant, where it was going, and registering, I think, there quite a lot of, I mean, you could say, you could be cynical about the people there and say, you know, they're all linked to fossil fuel interests, or they're all linked to national interests, or technocratic interests, but actually, you know, a lot of the people there are really there looking to find a solution. It's just they have very different ideas about what the solution might be. So I thought, I mean, one idea that kind of I thought about a lot in this, in relation to this COP and more generally, is this net zero language, which is obviously actually relatively recent, with the idea that we need to get to net zero by 2050, and all these swathes of net zero commitments from oil companies, but also from cities and governments, and what does that mean? And there were converging or diverging narratives, I guess, about what that means. On the one hand, there was a very strong sense that was mobilizing on the streets, but also in the sort of side events in the COP itself, about net zero not being real zero. It's all a smoke and mirror. It's all about, you know, basically using offsets instead of reductions, which rely on stealing land and false accounting, and yeah, no real action, compared with a very business-oriented line in another kind of event actually held in the same room, just hours apart, about transforming to net zero, led by business leaders who say that they're not hard to abate industries, they're happy to abate industries, and taking on board innovation, and they're going to be the leaders, and they're going to find the solutions, and they're going to, you know, be a coalition of the willing, and capital will lead the way. And I think, you know, genuinely in some ways believing that, and I think one thing that really struck me and really disillusioned me in a way was about how, I mean, Keston talked about how we really need to get away from this sort of business as usual, or this way of thinking about this extractive you know, economy based on exploitation. That's, you know, that's one view. That's just, but then there's this. How do you then shift other views that completely see it another way? And it's not just those sort of two views. Obviously, there's many others, and they're completely incommensurate and talking at cross purposes, and very rarely in the same room, and if so, clashing. So I would say that, you know, climate injustice was actually very much on show, on display throughout the COP, even in the official spaces. It was seen and showcased, but it was not seen at the same time. One of the most moving interventions that I heard, and yeah, widely reported immediately on social media and many news outlets as well, was by the youth activist Vanessa Nakete, and she made this provocation saying that, you know, we don't believe you, that we're here to prove us wrong. So talking about how, yeah, she made this statement as well, we have been here before, we don't believe that you're going to make any of these commitments, echoing a lot of the kind of real pessimism of many of the activists and the young activists in particular during the conference. So yeah, I really don't like to end on a down note, because I do think it's important to think, you know, what lessons can you learn? But I think you can't really, I mean, and nobody likes the story where you say, well, it's been a failure, because you could say, oh yes, it's been this great movement, there's all these people, we're all organized, they're all fighting, we have this consciousness. But what difference does the consciousness make? What difference does everybody knowing about all the science? It's not like the people there were needing to be convinced of the science. It was all, blatantly there, and the catastrophe and the inequality. But this is the least worst outcome. And so you see, minor wins, they say, in a sort of a pragmatic framework, but a huge boon for carbon offset markets, with the licensing of the continuation of land grabbing and theft of indigenous lands, among many others, which Harpreet and Keston outlined. And I thought, interventions that I started to hear that I hadn't heard so much before were like from the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, saying, this is basically a license to us for a moment of intensification, of resistance. I mean, you could point to the fossil fuel industry, you could point to whomever you think is to blame. If it's not that, then maybe it's political elites. But this sort of turn to complete disavowal of or rejection of trust in political and scientific leaders, and saying we really need to have we no longer have activism as usual. And so, I guess I left the conference with feeling like I knew less than I knew in the first place, and couldn't find a message to cohere in terms of optimism, and also I didn't hear any more of these kinds of calls about, I didn't witness any ramping up anywhere of, I mean, everyone is exhausted after that, and then the news cycle moves on. So I guess those aren't maybe terribly theoretical interventions, but they're just more kind of, as in COP language, just stock taking. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.